Jacques Derrida's Of Grammatology. 1. The end of the book and the beginning of writing. Socrates, he who does not write. Nietzsche. However the topic is considered, the problem of language has never been simply one problem among others. But never as much as at present has it invaded, as such, the global horizon of the most diverse researchers and the most heterogeneous discourses, diverse and heterogeneous in their intention, method, and ideology. The devaluation of the word language itself, and how, in the very hold it has upon us, it betrays a loose vocabulary, the temptation of a cheap seduction, the passive yielding to fashion, the consciousness of the avant-garde, in other words, ignorance, are evidences of this effect. This inflation of the sign language is the inflation of the sign itself, absolute inflation, inflation itself. Yet, by one of its aspects or shadows, it is itself still a sign. This crisis is also a symptom. It indicates, as if in spite of itself, that a historical metaphysical epoch must finally determine as language the totality of its problematic horizon. It must do so, not only because all that desire had wished to wrest from the play of language finds itself recaptured within that play, but also because, for the same reason, language itself is menaced in its very life, helpless, adrift in the threat of limitlessness, brought back to its own finitude at the very moment when its limits seem to disappear, when it ceases to be self-assured, contained, and guaranteed by the infinite signified which seem to exceed it. The program. By a slow movement, whose necessity is hardly perceptible, everything that for at least some 20 centuries tended toward and finally succeeded in being gathered under the name of language is beginning to let itself be transferred to, or at least summarized under, the name of writing. By a hardly perceptible necessity, it seems as though the concept of writing, no longer indicating a particular, derivative, auxiliary form of language in general, whether understood as communication, relation, expression, signification, constitution of meaning or thought, etc., no longer designating the exterior surface, the unsubstantial double of a major signifier, the signifier of the signifier, is beginning to go beyond the extension of language. In all senses of the word, writing thus comprehends language. Not that the word writing has ceased to designate the signifier of the signifier, but it appears, strange as it may seem, that signifier of the signifier no longer defines accidental doubling and fallen secondarity. Signifier of the signifier describes, on the contrary, the movement of language. In its origin, to be sure, but one can already suspect that an origin whose structure can be expressed as signifier of the signifier conceals and erases itself in its own production. There, the signified always already functions as a signifier. The secondarity that it seemed possible to ascribe to writing alone affects all signifieds in general, affects them always already, the moment they enter the game. There is not a single signifier that escapes, even if recaptured, the play of signifying references that constitute language. The advent of writing is the advent of this play. Today, such a play is coming into its own, effacing the limits starting from which one had thought to regulate the circulation of signs, drawing along with it all the reassuring signifiers, reducing all the strongholds, all the outer bounds shelters that watched over the field of language. This, strictly speaking, amounts to destroying the concept of sign and its entire logic. Undoubtedly, it is not by chance that this overwhelming supervenes at the moment when the extension of the concept of language effaces all its limits. We shall see that this overwhelming and this effacement have the same meaning, are one and the same phenomenon. It is as if the Western concept of language, in terms of what beyond its plurivocity and beyond the strict and problematic opposition of speech, parole, and language, langue, attaches it in general to phonematic or glossomatic production, to language, to voice, to hearing, to sound and breath, to speech, were revealed today as the guise or these guise of a primary writing, more fundamental than that which before this conversion passed for the simple supplement of the spoken word, Rousseau. Either writing has never a simple supplement, or it is urgently necessary to construct a new logic of the supplement. It is this urgency which will guide us further in reading Rousseau. These disguises are not historical contingencies that one might admire or regret. Their movement was absolutely necessary, with a necessity which cannot be judged by any other tribunal. The privilege of the Fournée does not depend upon a choice that could have been avoided. It responds to a moment of economy, let us say of the life, of history, or of being a self-relationship. The system of hearing, understanding oneself speak through the phonic substance, which presents itself as the non-exterior, non-mundane, therefore non-empirical or non-contingent signifier, has necessarily dominated the history of the world during an entire epoch, and has even produced the idea of the world, the idea of world origin that arises from the difference between the worldly and the non-worldly, the outside and the inside, ideality and non-ideality, universal and non-universal, transcendental and empirical, etc. With an irregular and essentially precarious success, this movement would apparently have tended, as toward its telos, to confine writing to a secondary and instrumental function, translator of a full speech that was fully present to itself, to its signified, to the other, the very condition of the theme of presence in general. Techniques in the service of language, spokesman, interpreter of an originary speech, itself shielded from interpretation. Techniques in the service of language. I am not invoking a general essence of techniques which would be already familiar to us and would help us in understanding the narrow and historically determined concept of writing as an example. I believe, on the contrary, that a certain sort of question about the meaning and origin of writing proceeds, or at least merges with, a certain type of question about the meaning and origin of techniques. That is why the notion of technique can never simply clarify the notion of writing. It is therefore as if what we call language could have been, in its origin and its end, only a moment, an essential but determined mode, a phenomenon, an aspect, a species of writing. And as if it had succeeded in making us forget this, and in willfully misleading us, only in the course of an adventure, as that adventure itself. All in all, a short enough adventure. It merges with a history that has associated techniques with logocentric metaphysics for nearly 3 millennia, and it now seems to be approaching what is really its own exhaustion under the circumstances, and this is no more than one example among others of this death of the civilization of the book, of which so much is said and which manifests itself particularly through a convulsive proliferation of libraries. All appearances to the contrary, this death of the book undoubtedly announces, and in a certain sense always has announced, nothing but a death of speech, of a so-called full speech, and a new mutation in the history of writing, in history as writing, announces it at a distance of a few centuries. It is on that scale that we must reckon it here, being careful not to neglect the quality of a very heterogeneous historical duration. The acceleration is such, and such is qualitative meaning, that one would be equally wrong in making a careful evaluation according to past rhythms. Death of speech is, of course, a metaphor here. Before we speak of disappearance, we must think of a new situation for speech, of its subordination within a structure of which it will no longer be the archon. To affirm in this way that the concept of writing exceeds and comprehends that of language presupposes, of course, a certain definition of language and of writing. If we do not attempt to justify it, we shall be giving in to the movement of inflation that we have just mentioned, which has also taken over the word writing, and that not fortuitously. For some time now, as a matter of fact, here and there, by a gesture and for motives that are profoundly necessary, whose degradation is easier to denounce than it is to disclose their origin, one says language for action, movement, thought, reflection, consciousness, unconsciousness, experience, affectivity, etc. Now we tend to say writing for all that and more, to designate not only the physical gestures of literal pictographic or ideographic inscription, but also the totality of what makes it possible, and also, beyond the signifying face, the signified face itself. And thus we say writing for all that gives rise to an inscription in general, whether it is literal or not, and even if what it distributes in space is alien to the order of the voice. Cinematography, choreography, of course, but also pictorial, musical, sculptural writing. One might also speak of athletic writing, and with even greater certainty of military or political writing, in view of the techniques that govern those domains today. All this to describe not only the system of notation secondarily connected with these activities, but the essence and the content of these activities themselves. It is also in this sense that the contemporary biologist speaks of writing and program in relation to the most elementary processes of information within the living cell. And, finally, whether it has essential limits or not, the entire field covered by the cybernetic program will be the field of writing. If the theory of cybernetics is by itself to oust all metaphysical concepts, including the concepts of soul, of life, of value, of choice, of memory, which until recently served to separate the machine from man. It must conserve the notion of writing, trace, grammaire, or grapheme, until its own historical, metaphysical character is also exposed. Even before being determined as human, with all the distinctive characteristics that have always been attributed to man and the entire system of significations that they imply, or non-human, the grammaire, or the grapheme, would thus name the element, an element without simplicity, an element, whether it is understood as the medium or as the irreducible atom of the arche-synthesis in general, or what one must forbid oneself to define within the system of oppositions of metaphysics, of what, consequently, one should not even call experience in general, that is to say, the origin of meaning in general. This situation has always already been announced. Why is it today in the process of making itself known as such and after the fact? This question would call forth an interminable analysis. Let us simply choose some points of departure in order to introduce the limited remarks to which I shall confine myself. I have already alluded to theoretical mathematics. Its writing, whether understood as a sensible graphie, and that already presupposes an identity, therefore an ideality of its form, which in principle renders absurd the so easily admitted notion of the sensible signifier, or understood as the ideal synthesis of signifieds, or a trace operative on another level, or whether it is understood more profoundly as the passage of the one to the other, has never been absolutely linked with a phonetic production. Within cultures practicing so-called phonetic writing, mathematics is not just an enclave. That is mentioned by all historians of writing. They recall, at the same time, the imperfections of alphabetic writing, which passed for so long as the most convenient and the most intelligent writing. This enclave is also the place where the practice of scientific language challenges intrinsically and with increasing profundity the ideal of phonetic writing and all its implicit metaphysics, metaphysics itself. Particularly, there is the philosophical idea of the episteme, also of historia, a concept profoundly related to it in spite of the dissociation or opposition which has distinguished one from the other during one phase of their common progress. History and knowledge, historia and episteme, have always been determined, and not only etymologically or philosophically, as detours for the purpose of the reappropriation of presence. But beyond theoretical mathematics, the development of the practical methods of information retrieval extends the possibilities of the message vastly, to the point where it is no longer the written translation of a language, the transporting of a signified which could remain spoken in its integrity. It goes hand in hand with an extension of phonography and of all the means of conserving the spoken language, of making it function without the presence of the speaking subject. This development, coupled with that of anthropology and of the history of writing, teaches us that phonetic writing, the medium of the great metaphysical, scientific, technical, and economic adventure of the West, is limited in space and time, and limits itself, even as it is in the process of imposing its law upon the cultural areas that had escaped it. But this non-fortuitous conjunction of cybernetics and the human sciences of writing leads to a more profound reversal. The signifier and truth. The rationality, but perhaps that word should be abandoned for reasons that will appear at the end of this sentence, which governs a writing thus enlarged and radicalized, no longer issues from a logos. Further, it inaugurates the destruction, not the demolition, but the de-sedimentation, the deconstruction of all the significations that have their source in that of the logos, particularly the signification of truth. All the metaphysical determinations of truth, and even the one beyond metaphysical ontotheology that Heidegger reminds us of, are more or less immediately inseparable from the instance of the Logos, or of a reason thought within the lineage of the Logos, in whatever sense it is understood. In the pre-Socratic or the philosophical sense, in the sense of God's infinite understanding, or in the anthropological sense, in the pre-Hegelian or the post-Hegelian sense. Within this logos, the original and essential link to the phone has never been broken. It would be easy to demonstrate this, and I shall attempt such a demonstration later. As has been more or less implicit determined, the essence of the phone would be immediately proximate to that which within thought as logos relates to meaning, produces it, receives it, speaks it, composes it. If, for Aristotle, for example, spoken words, ta entephone, are the symbols of mental experience, pathematates psyches, and written words are the symbols of spoken words, De Interpretatione 16a3. It is because the voice, producer of the first symbols, has a relationship of essential and immediate proximity with the mind. Producer of the first signifier, it is not just a simple signifier among others. It produces mental experiences which themselves reflect or mirror things by natural resemblance. Between being and mind, things and feelings, there would be a relationship of translation or natural signification. Between mind and logos, a relationship of conventional symbolization. And the first convention, which would relate immediately to the order of natural and universal signification, would be produced as spoken language. Written language would establish the conventions, interlinking other conventions with them. Just as all men have not the same writing, so all men have not the same speech sounds, but mental experiences, of which these are the primary symbols, are the same for all, as also are those things of which our experiences are the images. Aristotle, De Interpretatione. The feelings of the mind, expressing things naturally, constitute a sort of universal language which can then efface itself. It is the stage of transparence. Aristotle can sometimes omit it without risk. In every sense, the voice is closest to the signified, whether it is determined strictly as sense, thought, or lit, or more loosely as thing. All signifiers, and first and foremost the written signifier, are derivative with regard to what would wed the voice indissolubly to the mind or to the thought of the signified sense, indeed to the thing itself. Whether it is done in the Aristotelian manner, that we have just indicated, or in the manner of medieval theology, determining the res as a thing created from its eidos, from its sense thought in the logos, or in the infinite understanding of God. The written signifier is always technical and representative. It has no constitutive meaning. This derivation is the very origin of the notion of the signifier. The notion of the sign always implies within itself the distinction between signifier and signified, even if, as Saussure argues, they are distinguished simply as the two faces of one and the same leaf. This notion remains, therefore, within the heritage of that logocentrism, which is also a phonocentrism. Absolute proximity of voice and being, of voice and the meaning of being, of voice and the ideality of meaning. Hegel demonstrates very clearly the strange privilege of sound in idealization, the production of the concept and the self-presence of the subject. This ideal motion, in which, through the sound, what is, as it were, the simple subjectivity, the soul of the material thing expresses itself, the ear receives also in a theoretical way, just as the eye, shape and color, thus allowing the interiority of the object to become interiority itself. The ear, on the contrary, perceives the result of that interior vibration of material substance without placing itself in a practical relation toward the object, a result by means of which it is no longer the material form in its repose, but the first, more ideal activity of the soul itself, which is manifested. What is said of sound in general is a fortiori valid for the phonē, by which, by virtue of hearing, understanding oneself speak, an indissociable system, the subject affects itself and is related to itself in the element of ideality. We already have a foreboding that phonocentrism merges with the historical determination of the meaning of being in general as presence, with all the subdeterminations which depend on this general form, and which organize within it their system and their historical sequence. Presence of the thing to the sight as eidos, presence as substance, essence, existence, temporal presence as point of the now or of the moment, the self-presence of the cogito, consciousness, subjectivity, the co-presence of the other and of the self, intersubjectivity as the intentional phenomenon of the ego, and so forth. Logocentrism would thus support the determination of the being of the entity as presence. To the extent that such a logocentrism is not totally absent from Heidegger's thought, perhaps it still holds that thought within the epoch of ontotheology, within the philosophy of presence, that is to say, within philosophy itself. This would perhaps mean that one does not leave the epoch whose closure one can outline. The movements of belonging or not belonging to the epoch are too subtle, the illusions in that regard are too easy for us to make a definite judgment. The epoch of the Logos, thus the basis writing, considered as mediation of mediation and as a fall into the exteriority of meaning. To this epoch belongs the difference between signified and signifier, or at least the strange separation of their parallelism and the exteriority, however extenuated, of the one to the other. This appurtenance is organized and hierarchized in a history. The difference between signified and signifier belongs in a profound and implicit way to the totality of the great epoch covered by the history of metaphysics, and in a more explicit and more systematically articulated way to the narrower epoch of Christian creationism and infinitism, when these appropriate the resources of Greek conceptuality. This appurtenance is essential and irreducible. One cannot retain the convenience or the scientific truth of the Stoic and later medieval opposition between signans and signatum without also bringing with it all the metaphysical theological roots. To these roots adheres not only the distinction between the sensible and the intelligible, already a great deal, with all that it controls, namely metaphysics in its totality. And this distinction is generally accepted as self-evident by the most careful linguists and semiologists, even by those who believe that the scientificity of their work begins where metaphysic ends. Thus, for example, as modern structural thought has clearly realized, language is a system of science, and linguistics is part and parcel of the science of science, or semiotics, ce sur sémiologie. The medieval definition of sign, aliquid stat pro aliquo, has been resurrected and put forward as still valid and productive. Thus, the constitutive mark of any sign in general, and of any linguistic sign in particular, is its twofold character. Every linguistic unit is bipartite and involves both aspects, one sensible and the other intelligible, or, in other words, both the signans, signifier, cesures, signifiant, and the signatum, signified, signifié. These two constituents of a linguistic sign, and of sign in general, necessarily suppose and require each other. But to these metaphysical theological roots, many other hidden sediments cling. The semiological, or more specifically, linguistic science, cannot therefore hold on to the difference between signifier and signified, the very idea of the sign, without the difference between sensible and intelligible, certainly, but also not without retaining, more profoundly and more implicitly, and by the same token, the reference to a signified able to take place in its intelligibility, before its fall, before any expulsion into the exteriority of the sensible here below. As the face of pure intelligibility, it refers to an absolute logos, to which it is immediately united. This absolute logos was an infinite creative subjectivity in medieval theology. The intelligible face of the sign remains turned toward the Word and the face of God. Of course, it is not a question of rejecting these notions. They are necessary, and, at least at present, nothing is conceivable for us without them. It is a question at first of demonstrating the systematic and historical solidarity of the concepts and gestures of thought that one often believes can be innocently separated. The sign and divinity have the same place and time of birth. The age of the sign is essentially theological. Perhaps it will never end. Its historical closure is, however, outlined. Since these concepts are indispensable for unsettling the heritage to which they belong, we should be even less prone to renounce them. Within the closure, by an oblique and always perilous movement, constantly risking falling back within what is being deconstructed, it is necessary to surround the critical concepts with a careful and thorough discourse. to mark the conditions, the medium, and the limits of their effectiveness, and to designate rigorously their intimate relationship to the machine whose deconstruction they permit, and, in the same process, designate the crevice through which the yet unnameable glimmer beyond the closure can be glimpsed. The concept of the sign is here exemplary. We have just marked its metaphysical appurtenance. We know, however, that the thematics of the sign have been for about a century the agonized labor of a tradition that professed to withdraw meaning, truth, presence, being, etc., from the movement of signification, treating as suspect, as I just have, the difference between signified and signifier, or the idea of the sign in general. I must state explicitly that it is not a question of doing so in terms of the instance of the present truth, anterior, exterior, or superior to the sign, or in terms of the place of the effaced difference. Quite the contrary. We are disturbed by that which, in the concept of the sign, which has never existed or functioned outside the history of the philosophy of presence, remains systematically and genealogically determined by that history. It is there that the concept, and above all the work of deconstruction, its style, remain by nature exposed to misunderstanding and non-recognition. The exteriority of the signifier is the exteriority of writing in general, and I shall try to show later that there is no linguistic sign before writing. Without that exteriority, the very idea of the sign falls into decay. Since our entire world and language would collapse with it, and since its evidence and its value keep, to a certain point of derivation, an indestructible solidity, it would be silly to conclude from its placement within an epoch that it is necessary to move on to something else, to dispose of the sign, of the term, and the notion. For a proper understanding of the gesture that we are sketching here, one must understand the expressions epoch, closure of an epoch, historical genealogy in a new way, and must first remove them from all relativism. Thus, within this epoch, reading and writing, the production or interpretation of signs, the text in general as fabric of signs, allow themselves to be confined within secondariness. They are preceded by a truth or a meaning already constituted by and within the element of the logos. Even when the thing, the referent, is not immediately related to the logos of a creator God, where it began by being the spoken, thought, sense, the signified has, at any rate, an immediate relationship with the logos in general, finite or infinite, and a mediated one with the signifier, that is to say, with the exteriority of writing. When it seems to go otherwise, it is because a metaphoric mediation has insinuated itself into the relationship and has simulated immediacy. The writing of truth in the soul, opposed by Phaedrus 278a to bad writing, writing in the literal and ordinary sense, sensible writing in space, the book of nature and God's writing, especially in the Middle Ages. All that functions as metaphor in these discourses, confirms the privilege of the logos, and founds the literal meaning then given to writing. A sign signifying a signifier itself, signifying an eternal verity, eternally thought and spoken in the proximity of a present logos. The paradox to which attention must be paid is this: natural and universal writing, intelligible and non-temporal writing, is thus named by metaphor. A writing that is sensible, finite, and so on, is designated as writing in the literal sense. It is thus thought on the side of culture, technique, and artifice, a human procedure, the ruse of a being accidentally incarnated or of a finite creature. Of course, this metaphor remains enigmatic and refers to a literal meaning of writing as the first metaphor. This literal meaning is yet unthought by the adherents of this discourse. It is not, therefore, a matter of inverting the literal meaning and the figurative meaning, but of determining the literal meaning of writing as metaphoricity itself. In The Symbolism of the Book, that excellent chapter of European Literature and the Latin Middle Ages, E.R. Curtius describes with great wealth of examples the evolution that led from the Phaedrus to Calderon until it seemed to be precisely the reverse by the newly attained position of the book. But it seems that this modification, however important in fact it might be, conceals a fundamental continuity. As was the case with the Platonic writing of the truth in the soul, in the Middle Ages too, it is a writing understood in the metaphoric sense, that is to say, a natural, eternal, and universal writing, the system of signified truth, which is recognized in its dignity. As in the Phaedrus, a certain fallen writing continues to be opposed with. There remains to be written a history of this metaphor, a metaphor that systematically contrasts divine or natural writing and the human and laborious, finite and artificial inscription. It remains to articulate rigorously the stages of that history, as marked by the quotations below, and to follow the theme of God's book, nature or law, indeed natural law, through all its modifications. Rabbi Eliza said, "If all the seas were of ink, and all the ponds planted with reeds, if the sky and the earth were parchments, and if all human beings practiced the art of writing, they would not exhaust the Torah I have learned, just as the Torah itself would not be diminished any more than is the sea by the water removed by a paintbrush dipped in it." Galileo. The book of nature is written in a mathematical language. Descartes. To read in the great book of nature. De Meyer, in the name of natural religion, in the dialogues of Hume. And this volume of nature contains a great and inexplicable riddle, more than any intelligible discourse or reasoning. Bonnet. It would seem more philosophical to me to presume that our earth is a book that God has given to intelligences far superior to ours to read, and where they study in depth the infinitely multiplied and varied characters of His adorable wisdom. G. H. von Schubert. This language, made of images and hieroglyphs, which supreme wisdom uses in all its revelations to humanity, which is found in the inferior language of poetry, and which, in the most inferior and imperfect way, is more like the metaphorical expression of the dream than the prose of a wakefulness, we may wonder if this language is not the true and wakeful language of the superior regions, if, when we consider ourselves awakened, we are not plunged in a millennial slumber, or at least in the echo of its dreams, where we only perceive a few isolated and obscure words of God's language, as a sleeper perceives the conversation of the people around him. Jaspers. The world is the manuscript of another, inaccessible to a universal reading, which only existence deciphers. Above all, the profound differences distinguishing all these treatments of the same metaphor must not be ignored. In the history of this treatment, the most decisive separation appears at the moment when, at the same time as the science of nature, the determination of absolute presence is constituted as self-presence, as subjectivity. It is the moment of the great rationalisms of the 17th century. From then on, the condemnation of fallen and finite writing will take another form, within which we still live. It is non-self-presence that will be denounced. Thus the exemplariness of the Rousseauist moment, which we shall deal with later, begins to be explained. Rousseau repeats the Platonic gesture by referring to another model of presence, self-presence in the senses, in the sensible cogito, which simultaneously carries in itself the inscription of divine law. On the one hand, representative, fallen, secondary, instituted writing, writing in the literal and strict sense, is condemned in the Essay on the Origin of Languages. It enervates speech. To judge genius from books is like painting a man's portrait from his corpse, etc. Writing in the common sense is the dead letter. It is the carrier of death. It exhausts life. On the other hand, on the other face of the same proposition, writing in the metaphoric sense, natural, divine, and living writing, is venerated. It is equal in dignity to the origin of value, to the voice of conscience as divine law, to the heart, to sentiment, and so forth. The Bible is the most sublime of all books, but it is, after all, a book. It is not at all in a few sparse pages that one should look for God's law, but in the human heart where his hand deigned to write, lettre averne. If the natural law had been written only in the human reason, it would be little capable of directing most of our actions. But it is also engraved in the heart of man in ineffable characters. There it cries to him, l'état de guerre. Natural writing is immediately united to the voice and to breath. Its nature is not grammatological, but pneumatological. It is hieratic, very close to the interior holy voice of the profession of faith, to the voice one hears upon retreating into oneself. Full and truthful presence of the divine voice to our inner sense. The more I retreat into myself, the more I consult myself, the more plainly do I read these words written in my soul. Be just, and you will be happy. I do not derive these rules from the principles of the higher philosophy. I find them in the depths of my heart, written by nature in characters which nothing can efface. There is much to say about the fact that the native unity of the voice in writing is prescriptive. Arce's speech is writing because it is a law, a natural law. The beginning word is understood in the intimacy of self-presence as the voice of the other and as a commandment. There is therefore a good and a bad writing. The good and natural is the divine inscription in the heart and the soul. The perverse and artful is technique exiled in the exteriority of the body. A modification well within the Platonic diagram, writing of the soul and of the body, writing of the interior and of the exterior, writing of conscience and of the passions, as there is a voice of the soul and the voice of the body. Conscience is the voice of the soul, the passions are the voice of the body. Page 249. One must constantly go back toward the voice of nature, the holy voice of nature, that merges with the divine inscription and prescription. One must encounter oneself within it, enter into a dialogue within its signs, speak and respond to oneself in its pages. It was as if nature had spread out all her magnificence in front of our eyes to offer its text for our consideration. I have therefore closed all the books. Only one is open to all eyes. It is the book of nature. In this great and sublime book, I learned to serve and adore its author. The good writing has therefore always been comprehended as that which had to be comprehended, within a nature or a natural law, created or not, but first thought within an eternal presence. Comprehended, therefore, within a totality, and enveloped in a volume or a book. The idea of the book is the idea of a totality, finite or infinite, of the signifier. This totality of the signifier cannot be a totality unless a totality constituted by the signified pre-exists it, supervises its inscriptions and its signs, and is independent of it in its ideality. The idea of the book, which always refers to a natural totality, is profoundly alien to the sense of writing. It is the encyclopedic protection of theology and of logocentrism against the disruption of writing, against its aphoristic energy, and, as I shall specify later, against difference in general. If I distinguish the text from the book, I shall say that the destruction of the book, as it is now underway in all domains, denudes the surface of the text. That necessary violence responds to a violence that was no less necessary. The written being, the being written. The reassuring evidence within which Western tradition had to organize itself and must continue to live would therefore be as follows. The order of the signified is never contemporary, is at best the subtly discrepant inverse or parallel, discrepant by the time of a breath, from the order of the signifier. And the sign must be the unity of her heterogeneity, since the signified, sense or thing, noem or reality, is not in itself a signifier, a trace. In any case, is not constituted in its sense by its relationship with a possible trace. The formal essence of the signified is presence, and the privilege of its proximity to the logos as phone is the privilege of presence. This is the inevitable response as soon as one asks, what is the sign? That is to say, when one submits the sign to the question of essence, to the esti. The formal essence of the sign can only be determined in terms of presence. One cannot get around that response except by challenging the very form of the question and beginning to think that the sign is that ill-named thing, the only one that escapes the instituting question of philosophy. What is radicalizing concepts of interpretation, perspective, evaluation, difference, and all the empiricist and non-philosophical motifs that have constantly tormented philosophy throughout the history of the West, and besides, have had nothing but the inevitable weakness of being produced in the field of philosophy. Nietzsche, far from remaining simply, with Hegel and as Heidegger wished, within metaphysics, contributed a great deal to the liberation of the signifier from its dependence or derivation with respect to the logos and the related concept of truth or the primary signified, in whatever sense that is understood. Reading, and therefore writing, the text were for Nietzsche originary operations. I put that word within quotation marks for reasons to appear later. With regard to a sense that they do not first have to transcribe or discover, which would not therefore be a truth signified in the original element and presence of the logos, as topos noetos, divine understanding, or the structure of a priori necessity. To save Nietzsche from a reading of the Heideggerian type, it seems that we must, above all, not attempt to restore or make explicit a less naive ontology, composed of profound ontological intuitions acceding to some originary truth, an entire fundamentality hidden under the appearance of an empiricist or metaphysical text. The virulence of Nietzschean thought could not be more completely misunderstood. On the contrary, one must accentuate the naivete of a breakthrough which cannot attempt a step outside of metaphysics, which cannot criticize metaphysics radically without still utilizing in a certain way, in a certain type or a certain style of text, propositions that, read within the philosophic corpus, that is to say, according to Nietzsche, ill-read or unread, have always been and will always be naivetes, incoherent signs of an absolute appurtenance. Therefore, rather than protect Nietzsche from the Heideggerian reading, we should perhaps offer him up to it completely, underwriting that interpretation without reserve. In a certain way, and up to the point where, the content of the Nietzschean discourse being almost lost for the question of being, its form regains its absolute strangeness, where his text finally invokes a different type of reading, more faithful to his type of writing. Nietzsche has written what he has written. He has written that writing, and first of all his own, is not originally subordinate to the logos and to truth, and that this subordination has come into being during an epoch whose meaning we must deconstruct. Now, in this direction, but only in this direction, for read otherwise, the Nietzschean demolition remains dogmatic and, like all reversals, the captive of that metaphysical edifice which it professes to overthrow. On that point, and in that order of reading, the conclusions of Heidegger and Fink are irrefutable. Heideggerian thought would reinstate rather than destroy the instance of the logos and of the truth of being as primum signatum, the transcendental signified, transcendental in a certain sense, as in the Middle Ages the transcendental ens unum verum bonum was said to be the primum cognitum, implied by all categories or all determined significations, by all lexicons and all syntax, and therefore by all linguistic signifiers, though not to be identified simply with any of those signifiers, allowing itself to be pre-comprehended through each of them, remaining irreducible to all the epochal determinations that it nonetheless makes possible, thus opening the history of the Logos, yet itself being only through the Logos, that is, being nothing before the Logos and outside of it. The Logos of being, thought obeying the voice of being, is the first and the last resource of the sign of the difference between signans and signatum. There has to be a transcendental signified for the difference between signifier and signified to be somewhere absolute and irreducible. It is not by chance that the thought of being, as the thought of this transcendental signified, is manifested above all in the voice, in a language of words. The voice is heard, understood. That undoubtedly is what is called conscious, closest to the self as the absolute effacement of the signifier, pure auto-affection that necessarily has the form of time and which does not borrow from outside of itself in the world or in reality any accessory signifier, any substance of expression foreign to its own spontaneity. It is the unique experience of the signified, producing itself spontaneously from within the self, and nevertheless, as signified concept, in the element of ideality or universality. The unworldly character of this substance of expression is constitutive of this ideality. This experience of the effacement of the signifier in the voice is not merely one illusion among many, since it is the condition of the very idea of truth, but I shall elsewhere show in what it does delude itself. This illusion is the history of truth, and it cannot be dissipated so quickly. Within the closure of this experience, the word is lived as the elementary and undecomposable unity of the signified and the voice, of the concept and a transparent substance of expression. This experience is considered in its greatest purity, and at the same time in the condition of its possibility, as the experience of being. The word being, or at any rate the words designating the sense of being in different languages, is in some others an originary word, urvort, the transcendental word assuring the possibility of being word to all other words. As such, it is pre-comprehended in all language, and this is the opening of being and time. Only this pre-comprehension would permit the opening of the question of the sense of being in general, beyond all regional ontologies and all metaphysics. A question that broaches philosophy, for example, in the Sophists, and lets itself be taken over by philosophy. A question that Heidegger repeats by submitting the history of metaphysics to it. Heidegger reminds us constantly that the sense of being is neither the word being nor the concept of being. But as that sense is nothing outside of language and the language of words, it is tied, if not to a particular word or to a particular system of language, consesso non dato, at least to the possibility of the word in general, and to the possibility of its irreducible simplicity. One could thus think that it remains only to choose between two possibilities. 1. Does modern linguistics, a science of signification breaking the unity of the word and breaking it with its alleged irreducibility, still have anything to do with the language? Heidegger would probably doubt it too. Conversely, is not all that is profoundly meditated as the thought or the question of being enclosed within an old linguistics of the word, which one practices here unknowingly? Unknowingly, because such a linguistics, whether spontaneous or systematic, has always had to share the presuppositions of metaphysics. The two operate on the same grounds. It goes without saying that the alternatives cannot be so simple. On the one hand, if modern linguistics remains completely enclosed within a classical conceptuality, if especially it naively uses the word being and all that it presupposes, that which within this linguistics deconstructs the unity of the word in general, can no longer, according to the model of the Heideggerian question, as it functions powerfully from the very opening of being and time, be circumscribed as ontic science or regional ontology. Inasmuch as the question of being unites indissolubly with the pre-comprehension of the word being, without being reduced to it, the linguistics that works for the deconstruction of the constituted unity of that word has only, in fact, or in principle, to have the question of being posed in order to define its field and the order of its dependence. Not only is its field no longer simply ontic, but the limits of ontology that correspond to it no longer have anything regional about them. And can what I say here of linguistics, or at least of a certain work that may be undertaken within it and thanks to it, not be said of all research, inasmuch as, and to the strict extent that, it would finally deconstitute the founding concept words of ontology, of being in its privilege. Outside of linguistics, it is in psychoanalytic research that this breakthrough seems at present to have the greatest likelihood of being expanded. Within the strictly limited space of this breakthrough, these sciences are no longer dominated by the questions of a transcendental phenomenology or a fundamental ontology. One may perhaps say, following the order of questions inaugurated by being and time, and radicalizing the questions of Husserlian phenomenology, that this breakthrough does not belong to science itself, that what thus seemed to be produced within this ontic field or within a regional ontology does not belong to them by rights, and leads back to the question of being itself. Because it is indeed the question of being that Heidegger asks metaphysics, and with it the question of truth, of sense, of the Logos. The incessant meditation upon that question does not restore confidence. On the contrary, it dislodges the confidence at its own depth, which, being a matter of the meaning of being, is more difficult than is often believed. In examining the state just before all determinations of being, destroying the securities of ontotheology, such a meditation contributes, quite as much as the most contemporary linguistics, to the dislocation of the unity of the sense of being, that is, in the last instance, the unity of the word. It is thus that, after evoking the voice of being, Heidegger recalls that it is silent, mute, insonorous, wordless, or originally aphonic. The voice of the sources is not heard. A rupture between the originary meaning of being and the word, between meaning and the voice, between the voice of being and the phone, between the call of being and articulated sound. Such a rupture, which at once confirms a fundamental metaphor and renders it suspect by accentuating its metaphoric discrepancy, translates the ambiguity of the Heideggerian situation with respect to the metaphysics of presence and logocentrism. It is at once contained within it and transgresses it, but it is impossible to separate the two. The very movement of transgression sometimes holds it back short of the limit. In opposition to what we suggested above, it must be remembered that, for Heidegger, the sense of being is never simply and rigorously as signified. It is not by chance that the word is not used. That means that being escapes the movement of the sign, a proposition that can equally well be understood as a repetition of the classical tradition and as a caution with respect to a technical or metaphysical theory of signification. On the other hand, the sense of being is literally neither primary nor fundamental, nor transcendental, whether understood in the scholastic, Kantian, or Husserlian sense. The restoration of being as transcending the categories of the entity, the opening of the fundamental ontology, are nothing but necessary yet provisional moments. From the introduction to metaphysics onward, Heidegger renounces the project of and the word ontology. The necessary, originary, and irreducible dissimulation of the meaning of being, its occultation within the very blossoming forth of presence, that retreat without which there would be no history of being, which was completely history and history of being. Heidegger's insistence on noting that being is produced as history only through the logos, and is nothing outside of it, the difference between being and the entity. All this clearly indicates that fundamentally nothing escapes the movement of the signifier, and that, in the last instance, the difference between signified and signifier is nothing. This proposition of transgression, not yet integrated into a careful discourse, runs the risk of formulating regression itself. One must therefore go by way of the question of being, as it is directed by Heidegger and by him alone, at and beyond ontotheology, in order to reach the rigorous thought of that strange non-difference, and in order to determine it correctly. Heidegger occasionally reminds us that being, as it is fixed in its general syntactic and lexicological forms within linguistics and Western philosophy, is not a primary and absolutely irreducible signified, that it is still rooted in a system of languages and an historically determined significance, although strangely privileged as the virtue of disclosure and dissimulation. Particularly when he invites us to meditate on the privilege of the third person singular, of the present indicative, and the infinitive. Western metaphysics, as the limitation of the sense of being within the field of presence, is produced as the domination of a linguistic form. To question the origin of that domination does not amount to hypostatizing a transcendental signified, but to a questioning of what constitutes our history and what produced transcendentality itself. Heidegger brings it up also when in Zur Seinsfrage, for the same reason, he lets the word being be read only if it is crossed out. That mark of deletion is not, however, a merely negative symbol. That deletion is the final writing of an epoch. Under its strokes, the presence of a transcendental signified is effaced while still remaining legible. Is effaced while still remaining legible, is destroyed while making visible the very idea of the sign. Inasmuch as it delimits ontotheology, the metaphysics of presence and logocentrism, this last writing is also the first writing. To come to recognize, not within but on the horizon of the Heideggerian paths, and yet in them, that the sense of being is not a transcendental or trans-epochal signified, even if it was always dissimulated within the epoch, but already, in a truly unheard of sense, a determined signifying trace, is to affirm that within the decisive concept of ontological difference, all is not to be thought at one go. Entity and being, ontic and ontological, ontico-ontological, are, in an original style, derivative with regard to difference, and with respect to what I shall later call différence, an economic concept designating the production of differing. The ontico-ontological difference and its ground in the transcendence of Dasein are not absolutely originary. Difference by itself would be more originary, but one would no longer be able to call it origin or ground. Those notions belong essentially to the history of ontotheology, to the system functioning as the effacing of difference. It can, however, be thought of in the closest proximity to itself only on one condition, that one begins by determining it as the ontico-ontological difference before erasing that determination. The necessity of passing through that erased determination, the necessity of that trick of writing, is irreducible. An unemphatic and difficult thought that, through much unperceived mediation, must carry the entire burden of our question, a question that I shall provisionally call historical. It is with its help that I shall later be able to attempt to relate difference and writing. The hesitation of these thoughts, here Nietzsche's and Heidegger's, is not an incoherence. It is a trembling proper to all post-Hegelian attempts and to this passage between two epochs. The movements of deconstruction do not destroy structures from the outside. They are not possible and effective, nor can they take accurate aim except by inhabiting those structures, inhabiting them in a certain way, because one always inhabits, and all the more when one does not suspect it, operating necessarily from the inside, borrowing all the strategic and economic resources of subversion from the old structure, borrowing them structurally, that is to say, without being able to isolate their elements and atoms. The enterprise of deconstruction always, in a certain way, falls prey to its own work. This is what the person who has begun the same work in another area of the same habitation does not fail to point out with zeal. No exercise is more widespread today, and one should be able to formalize its rules. Hegel was already caught up in this game. On the one hand, he undoubtedly summed up the entire philosophy of the Logos. He determined ontology as absolute logic. He assembled all the delimitations of philosophy as presence. He assigned to presence the eschatology of Perusia of the self-proximity of infinite subjectivity. And, for the same reason, he had to debase or subordinate writing. When he criticizes the Leibnizian characteristic, the formalism of the understanding, and mathematical symbolism, he makes the same gesture, denouncing the being outside of itself of the Logos in the sensible or the intellectual abstraction. Writing is that forgetting of the self, that exteriorization, the contrary of the interiorizing memory, of the Erinnerung, that opens the history of the spirit. It is this that the Phaedrus said. Writing is at once mnemotechnique and the power of forgetting. Naturally, the Hegelian critique of writing stops at the alphabet. As phonetic writing, the alphabet is at the same time more servile, more contemptible, more secondary. Alphabetic writing expresses sounds, which are themselves signs. It consists, therefore, of the signs of signs. But it is also the best writing, the mind's writing. Its effacement before the voice, that in it which respects the ideal interiority of phonic signifiers, all that by which it sublimates space and sight, all that makes of it the writing of history, the writing, that is, of the infinite spirit relating to itself in its discourse and culture. It follows that to learn to read and write, an alphabetic writing should be regarded as a means to infinite culture that is not enough appreciated, because thus the mind, distancing itself from the concrete sense perceptible, directs its attention on the more formal moment, the sonorous word and its abstract elements, and contributes essentially to the founding and purifying of the ground of interiority within the subject. In that sense, it is the Aufhebung of other writings, particularly of hieroglyphic script and of the Leibnizian characteristic that had been criticized previously through one and the same gesture. Aufhebung is, more or less implicitly, the dominant concept of nearly all histories of writing, even today. It is the concept of history and of teleology. In fact, Hegel continues. Acquired habit later also suppresses the specificity of alphabetic writing, which consists in seeming to be, in the interest of sight, a detour through hearing to arrive at representations, and makes it into a hieroglyphic script for us, such that in using it we do not need to have present to our consciousness the mediation of sounds. It is on this condition that Hegel subscribes to the Leibnizian praise of non-phonetic writing. It can be produced by deaf mutes, Leibniz had said. Hegel. Beside the fact that, by the practice which transforms this alphabetic script into hieroglyphics, the aptitude for abstraction acquired through such an exercise is conserved, the reading of hieroglyphs is for itself a deaf reading and a mute writing. What is audible or temporal, visible or spatial, has each its proper basis, and in the first place they are of equal value. But in alphabetic script there is only one basis, and that following a specific relation, namely, that the visible language is related only as a sign to the audible language. Intelligence expresses itself immediately and unconditionally through speech. What writing itself in its non-phonetic moment betrays is life. It menaces at once the breath, the spirit, and history as the spirit's relationship with itself. It is their end, their finitude, their paralysis. Cutting breath short, sterilizing or immobilizing spiritual creation in the repetition of the letter, in the commentary or the exegesis, confined in a narrow space, reserved for a minority. It is the principle of death and of the difference in the becoming of being. It is to speech what China is to Europe. It is only to the eclecticism of Chinese spiritual culture that the hieroglyphic writing is suited. This type of writing is, besides, the part reserved for a very small section of a people, the section that possesses the exclusive domain of spiritual culture. A hieroglyphic script would require a philosophy as exegetical as Chinese culture generally is. If the non-phonetic moment menaces the history and the life of the spirit as self-presence in the breath, It is because it menaces substantiality, that other metaphysical name of presence and of ousia. First, in the form of the substantive. Non-phonetic writing breaks the noun part. It describes relations and not appellations. The noun and the word, those unities of breath and concept, are effaced within pure writing. In that regard, Leibniz is as disturbing as the Chinese in Europe. This situation, the analytic notation of representations in hieroglyphic script, which seduced Leibniz to the point of wrongly preferring this script to the alphabetic, rather contradicts the fundamental exigency of language in general, namely the noun. All difference in analysis would produce another formation of the written substantive. The horizon of absolute knowledge is the effacement of writing in the logos, the retrieval of the trace in parousia, the reappropriation of difference, the accomplishment of what I have elsewhere called the metaphysics of the proper. Yet all that Hegel thought within this horizon, all, that is, except eschatology, may be reread as a meditation on writing. Hegel is also the thinker of irreducible difference. He rehabilitated thought as the memory productive of science, and he reintroduced, as I shall try to show elsewhere, the essential necessity of the written trace in a philosophical, that is to say, Socratic, discourse that had always believed it possible to do without it. The last philosopher of the book and the first thinker of writing.